Is the Supreme Court going to let Donald Trump stay on the ballot? This is Eric Curry with Watch Nation News. The Supreme Court began hearing oral arguments in a case with historic implications that could determine whether the twice impeached former president remains on the ballot. Now, what I found particularly interesting is that 6 of the justices are conservative justices that, again, do normally side with the conservative wing, and then there are the 3 that normally side with the liberal wing. But what I found interesting is that perhaps the most liberal justices historically, Justice Kagan, presented this question as part of oral arguments, and I quote, "The question that you have to confront is why a single state gets to decide who can be president of the United States." I found this statement to be very deceiving. Again, I was very surprised that this came from Justice Kagan, of all people. But as we know, the Supreme Court case actually stems from the Colorado Supreme Court. However, to act like this decision is going to be the result of one state's lawsuit is incredibly deceiving, because Maine also has a pending lawsuit that is, they're watching to see how this case is determined. And there are at least 3 other states that are watching to see how this plays out. So to act like it's only one state that will be determining whether or not Donald Trump can remain on the ballot is incredibly, incredibly deceiving. Interestingly enough, shockingly enough, it seemed that only Justice Sotomayor is open to the idea of kicking Donald Trump off the ballot. So in response to Donald Trump's attorney's claim that the president has some form of immunity, Sotomayor responded, "This is," and I quote, "a gerrymandered rule designed only to benefit your client." So let's actually go back for a second to January 6, 2021, because I remember exactly where I was. I think it was maybe 2 hours earlier. They had called the cases or settled the cases in Georgia. So we won the Senate, right? Or it was a 50-50 split in the Senate. All of a sudden, you turn on the television and you see a group of armed protesters storming the Capitol. And I don't think that even during the Confederacy, a Confederate flag was ever displayed proudly in the People's House, the capital of the United States government. Again, we had people calling for the execution of Mike Pence. We had 3 police officers that died due to events that day. We had our lawmakers that were hiding out in chambers. We had at least 2 police officers that committed suicide shortly afterwards. At least 900 people have been apprehended. So to minimize the violence of that day, again, I just find it completely mind-boggling. So I was particularly surprised when I heard Justice Jackson's line of questioning, which seemed to obsess over whether the events of January 6th count as an insurrection or not. So Justice Jackson, and I quote, "How close can a person be to unquestionably violent and completely unacceptable lynch mob-like acts of others and still claim to be a non-dangerous, truly innocent bystander?" Which, again, whether or not the events of that day were violent, I think that goes without saying. What we really have to do is whether or not this man is a threat to the safety and security of our country. As a matter of fact, 9 House lawmakers sent a letter to the Supreme Court asking for Justice Thomas to recuse himself, because as you may or may not know, if you may not remember, Ginny Thomas, Justice Thomas's wife, actually owns a consulting firm. Liberty Consulting skyrocketed in clients during the Trump administration, essentially flatlined after he lost. And as part of that letter, these 9 lawmakers were asking that reasonable people aware of the relevant facts and circumstances doubt that you, Justice Thomas, can fairly discharge your duty to be impartial in hearing this case. I think it's also worth mentioning that one of the justices that sits on the Supreme Court, of the 3 that Donald Trump appointed, Justice Amy Coney Barrett was appointed 10 days before the election. So it will be incredibly interesting, to say the absolute very least, to see how this plays out. We could see a decision as early as Super Tuesday. So this is Eric Curry with Watch Nation News.